All right. Thank you all for coming. Hello and good evening. Thanks so much for joining us today for our OPT info session. I just want to, again, welcome everybody. My name is Dulce Cordova. I am a Student Immigration Advisor with the International Student and Scholar Affairs Office. And I'm joined today by my colleagues Zaina and Leah, who will feel free to jump in at any point if they feel like I need to add something else to what I'm saying. But again, this presentation will be recorded and we will be sending out the recording along with the slides after today's presentation so that you can have access to it. Please also note that all of the information that we're going to cover is already on our website, so you don't have to memorize anything, and you'll be able to refer to it whenever it is that you need to. And with that, we'll dive right in. As we mentioned earlier, there is a Q&A feature. Feel free to drop in your questions there. We will make sure to answer as many questions as we possibly can towards the end of the presentation. So just be patient with us. We're covering a lot of material, and I'm sure you're gonna have lots of questions. Chances are they will be answered before we go on to the next topic. So be patient with your questions, and we'll make sure to answer them all. So you are getting ready to graduate. You're getting ready to be done with your degree and move on to bigger and better things. And there are a lot of departments that you're going to be in contact with as you graduate. You're going to be in contact with your academic department. You're going to be in contact with the registrar, talking about transcripts and graduation certificates and whatnot. And you're also going to be navigating the immigration process of applying for OPT. You're going to be sending applications to USCIS. We'll talk a little bit about that obviously today. And you're also going to be navigating employment and finding a job and paying taxes. All of these things are stuff that you are still going to have to continue to do as you graduate and as you move on to the working period of your F1 status. Lots of responsibilities there, but it is important that you continue to maintain all of those reporting responsibilities and that you maintain contact with us as we will continue to guide you through your time on OPT. And it feels like a lot of stuff that you have to do, but it is important to continue to maintain your F1 status. Today, we're going to cover lots of information, and a lot of it will sound very repetitive, but it is important. The things that we continue to repeat are just super important for you to have a successful OPT. Today, we'll cover what is OPT, what you need to know about your eligibility, when do you request it, who do you request it from, what even is an I-765 application, and where are you going to request that, what are the fees associated with your OPT process, and we'll also make sure to answer lots of your questions and also mention a few of the common mistakes that we see students make, and we want to help you avoid doing the same mistakes. And again, stick around for a live Q&A session at the end. We are talking about your Form I-20 now. So in your Form I-20, if you have it in front of you, it's a great time to look at it and see it and follow along with what I'm saying. But essentially, the Form I-20 is what's going to be driving your OPT process. Your OPT will be based on your program end date. So if you're going to graduate in May, we're going to base that information on counting that you are going to graduate in May. But if you have a different program end date, then all the dates and the timelines that we give you are going to be driven by that end date. They're also going to be driven by your major, because your major will determine what work opportunities you'll be able to take advantage and what opportunities you might not be able to take advantage for. The signatures on page 1 should have a signature that we signed when we issued you the I-20. And before you submit this updated I-20 to apply for OPT, you'll need to make sure that it also has your signature on it as well. It probably doesn't have anything on page 2, but once you request your OPT I-20, you will see that there is employment authorization information there, what your OPT start and end dates are going to be, and it'll show that you have requested it at all. So at all times, it's important for you to just look over your Form I-20 and make sure that it's as accurate as possible. So what is OPT? OPT is optional practical training. It is essentially a work authorization for 12 months after you graduate. Has to be related to your field of study, but essentially it's going to give you that real life work experience while you're on OPT. Students that are on the STEM OPT will be eligible for an additional 24 months of work authorization, and we will briefly touch on the topic of STEM OPT, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to just cover the OPT, the post-OPT. Who is eligible for to apply for OPT? You are students that are valid on F1. They have a valid F1 status. So if you have a valid F1 status at the time you submit your application, you would be eligible. You have to make sure that you've been enrolled full-time in the U.S. For at least one academic year. So if you're on this call and you have not yet completed your academic year, then this might not be something. OPT might not be eligible for you, might not qualify for this. You may have, OPT is for those who have completed, I'm so sorry, I'm trying to not read from the slides when I'm reading from the slides. You should have not completed OPT at the same academic level. So if you had a bachelor's degree and you used your OPT benefit in the past, and now you are currently have a master's degree, you are eligible to use your OPT at the master's level. But if this is your second master's that you're working on, then you would not be able to qualify for OPT for that master's again. So again, not everybody will be eligible for OPT, but the majority who are on this call more than likely have a May graduation, and this would apply to them. Also important to remember that you are present when filing, that you are present in the United States when filing. This doesn't happen often, but if there's a student or a few students that have completed 12 months of full-time CPT, that would make them ineligible to apply for OPT at this academic level. When to apply. Again, your I-20 and the program end date is what's driving the eligibility of when you can apply. So it's important that you cannot apply more than 90 days before your program end date on your I-20. You do not need a job offer. You do not need to have an employment offer. You do not need to even know exactly where you're going to work to apply for OPT. But it is important that you start that position within 60 days of your program end date. And you will be allowed 90 days of unemployment within that authorization period. So while you don't need a job offer, do note that it is going to be limited to 12 months of work authorization. And while you're on OPT, you will continue to be under F1 status. The University of Notre Dame continues to be your sponsor, and ISSA will continue to support you throughout your time on OPT and STEM OPT if you're eligible. So your status while on OPT is F1. I'll pass it over to Sina. We'll talk about the application process and time.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Dulce. So Dulce and I are going to be tag teaming the presentation tonight, so you'll have the distinct pleasure of hearing from both of us. So moving on to the OPT application process and timeline. So what does this look like? This slide is, in a nutshell, what this entire OPT application process is going to look like from start to finish. I also want to reiterate what Dulce said at the beginning of the presentation, which is that all of the information we're covering tonight, all of the step-by-step instructions, all of the documents we're going to cover, this is also really explicitly covered on our OPT webpage. And then this recording will also be posted on the webpage too. So you'll be able to review all this information again if you forget later on. So very briefly, the first step in this entire process is submitting the request for a new I-20 with the OPT recommendation from ISSA. And we're going to get into a little bit deeper into what each of these steps entail, so not to worry about that. The second step is receiving, of course, that updated I-20 from ISSA, which you'll receive about 5 to 8 business days after you submit the request. I will note that part of the request, and then we're going to cover this again later, involves having your academic advisor sign off on the fact that you are indeed graduating this semester. And we at ISSA will not be able to process that OPT I-20 request until you have submitted your request and your advisor has signed off on it. So please note that our processing time will not start until we have both of those things, your part of the application and your advisor signing off. I will note that that advisor signing off is built into the e-form request. So 5 to 8 business days. The third step is to prepare electronic copies of all of the required documents that are part of that OPT application, in addition to the I-20 that you're going to receive from ISSA. We're going to go over what those documents are later on in the presentation, but as I mentioned, they're also listed out very clearly on our OPT webpage. The fourth step is to create a free online USCIS account that will allow you to file that I-765 application online. Additionally, moving on to the fifth step, you're going to continue to use that USCIS account not only to file that I-765 application, which to note, the I-765 is the formal application for work authorization. That is how you're actually formally applying for OPT. But you're going to use that USCIS account to also monitor your application as it moves through USCIS processing. So you'll receive your receipt notice as confirmation that they received your application. You'll be notified if you receive something like a request for evidence, which is kind of like a follow-up on your application by USCIS. And then you'll also be notified of approval or denial notice for that application. And again, you can monitor all of that through the USCIS account that you're going to create. And then finally, what we hope is the last and best step of all of this is when you actually receive that employment authorization document, also known as an EAD card, in the mail that is issued by USCIS. You would receive an EAD card once they approve, approve your application. So Dulce kind of mentioned the importance of the I-20 program end date previously, but we want to make sure that it's very clear that the I-20 program end date is really what's determining your OPT timeline here. So for most of you who are spring 2024 graduates, that program end date is going to be May 19th, 2024. And over here we say a mismatch in the current program end date. If you're looking at your I-20, which as Dulce mentioned, it would be helpful if you had that in front of you as we go over this presentation. If you're planning to graduate this spring 2024 and your program end date currently on the I-20 is later than spring 2024, that will get fixed through the OPT I-20 request process. So if you're graduating a little bit early than you were expected to and we issued your I-20, there's nothing that you need to do. That will get fixed as you let us know that you're graduating in this OPT I-20 request. Another important thing about that I-20 program end date is that from an immigration perspective, that is the end of the F1 academic program. And so the importance of that when we're talking about employment is that many of you may currently be working on campus. You may have, a student worker position. If you're a PhD student, you may have a TA position. And as soon as you pass that program end date, again, for spring 2024 grads, for the majority of you, will be May 19th. Any on-campus employment that you're pursuing becomes off-campus employment after that I-20 program end date. And so if you have a position that you're pursuing during your Notre Dame program, you would not be able to continue working after that I-20 program end date until you had further authorization. In this case, it would be post-completion OPT. So that's something that's really important to note for those of you that have employment on campus this semester. You should not be working after that program end date until you've been approved for OPT and are within that OPT period. A special note for our graduate students, for the most part, this will be for our PhD students who have a thesis or a dissertation requirement. There is a little bit more flexibility in this program end date for all of you, since your program end date does not align as closely or as strictly with the Notre Dame academic calendar. So specifically for our master's students with a thesis or our PhD students with their dissertation. When you're requesting that OPT I-20 and you're indicating to us at ISSA what your program end date is, what your completion date is, you're going to have a series of options to choose from. The most common, I would say, is the dissertation defense date. Many students choose to use this as their program completion date, but there are some other options. The other ones are the final dissertation submission date. So this would be when you submit that final version of your dissertation with all of your edits and revisions. This could potentially be the last day of your TA responsibilities, or if you're working with your faculty advisor on, in a lab, for example, if you are required to continue or finish those responsibilities before you complete the program, maybe you choose that as your completion date. And then the final option is the actual graduation date in the semester that you're graduating. Again, if that's the option that you choose for spring 2024, that would still be this May 19th date. But for example, if you're defending your dissertation on April 1st and you're formally graduating in May, you would have the option to choose to use that April 1st defense date as your completion date, or you could potentially choose that graduation date. You have a little bit more flexibility there. And as Dulce mentioned, whatever your completion date is, we at ISSA are really deferring to you and your academic advisor to make that decision, but your OPT timeline will shift according to your I-20 program end date. So that being said, the final point on this slide is understanding the distinction between your Notre Dame record and your immigration record. Again, primarily for our PhD students, if you indicate that you're using your dissertation defense date as your completion date for the purposes of your OPT application, essentially what we at ISSA are doing when we recommend you for OPT is shortening your I-20 program end date to that dissertation defense date. And so that may be different from what your Notre Dame academic record says is your degree conferral date. So let's stick with that April 1st example. If you're defending your dissertation on April 1st, and you want to use that as your completion date, we would shorten that I-20 end date to that April 1st date, and you would base your OPT timeline based off of that April 1st date, even though your Notre Dame academic record would show that you didn't officially graduate until May 19th. And that's totally fine. As Dulce mentioned at the beginning, that just means that you're going to have to make sure you're communicating with ISSA about your immigration record and communicating with your department about your academic record. So the general application timeline, as we mentioned, this timeline will not change. It will just adjust depending on your program end date on that I-20, your program completion date here at Notre Dame. So important timelines to be thinking about, and we know this is a lot of information. There's a lot of little deadlines to be managing throughout this process, but we're going to try to make it as clear as possible, and we'll show you this timeline in a few different ways in the coming slides. So the first one is this 30 days. So once you request your OPT I-20 from the ISSA office, we provide you a recommendation for OPT, which comes in the form of a new I-20. That is your OPT I-20. You will see the OPT recommendation on page 2 when we give it to you. That recommendation is only valid for 30 days at a time. What this means is that if you don't apply for OPT, if you don't file the I-765 within 30 days of ISSA issuing you that I-20, you will have to come back to ISSA to get a new I-20. We have many students that always forget this 30-day deadline, and they try to file for OPT more than 30 days after they've been given the new I-20 from ISSA. And we'll mention this again, but that application will of course be denied. And again, we have students that do this every year, and we want to make sure that you don't fall into that situation. So 30 days, that I-20 recommendation is valid for 30 days at a time. It's not to say that you can't file for OPT after 30 days. You can, you just need a new I-20 from ISSA to do it. So if you're getting close to that 30-day deadline, come talk to ISSA and we can help you. 90 days. So the earliest to apply for OPT before your program end date is 90 days. And we're going to cover, like I said, we're going to give you an example of what this might look like for a May 2024 graduation. But for those of you who are graduating in May, the earliest that you can formally apply to USCIS for OPT, the earliest you can file the I-765 is 90 days before that date, which will put you in February 19th. That date is going to come up again, so not to worry, you don't have to memorize it right now. The final one is 60 days. So you have 60 days following your program end date in order to request your OPT to begin. And you are going to tell us at the time that you request the I-20 when you would like to start working. And we're going to get into a little bit more about what goes into choosing that OPT start date. But regardless of the date that you choose, it must be within 60 days of completing your program. So like I said, here is a specific example of what this timeline might look like for many of you who are graduating in May 2024. So here, like we said, this program end date is really driving this OPT timeline. So this is our main date here. For many of you, May 19th, 2024, that's the graduation date for the spring 2024 semester at Notre Dame. As we said, the earliest to officially apply for OPT with USCIS is 90 days before that date, which puts us here at February 19th, 2024. So I would say mark your calendars for February 19th that this is the earliest that you can submit that I-765 application. Now, at ISSA, we are going to be processing hundreds of I-20s for those students applying for OPT. And so to ensure that we have enough time to process all of those requests, today, January 29th, after this session, we're going to kind of walk you through what it looks like to request that I-20. And today is the first day that you all can submit that application to ISSA to request the I-20. Again, that is just so that we have enough time to issue you your I-20 so that when February 19th comes around, you have everything that you need to submit that application. Because the processing time with USCIS is so long, it is about 3 to 3.5 months currently, and we're gonna mention that again later in the presentation. But because it does take quite a while for them to process that application, we advise all students to apply as early as possible. And there are a few reasons for that, but it is primarily because of the long processing time. I want to mention that even if you're planning to choose a start date that is quite late towards the end of that 60 days after your program end date, we are still advising that you apply as early as possible. So we have suggested this March 15th date for all of our students to go ahead and apply for OPT by that date. Now, you may be asking, well, how late can I apply for OPT? So we advise applying as early as possible, as I mentioned. However, technically, you have from the 90 days before your program end date, so here from February 19th, all the way through 60 days following your program end date, which would be July 18th for those of you graduating on May 19th. So you technically have about a 5-month window to apply for OPT. However, I do want to mention very clearly that applying later does not benefit you in any way. It is not going to allow you to have more time to search for a job or more time to remain in the US. It is just going to delay when you'll be able to begin working because you're still going to have at least a 3-month processing time if you apply on July 18th. And so we would just advise that you apply earlier so that you get the EAD card sooner. So again, what does it look like to choose those the OPT authorization dates? So as I mentioned, the authorization start date must be within the 60-day grace period after your program end date. So the earliest you could potentially choose to start working is May 20th, 2024, if you're graduating on May 19th, the day after your program end date. The latest authorization start date would be that 60th day, which, as we said in the previous slide, would be July 18th, 2024. You can choose any date during that 60-day period, but your your requested OPT start date must be during that 60-day window. One of the other reasons that we don't advise applying late, or rather one of the reasons that we recommend applying early is that the authorization end date that you receive will never be later than July 17th, 2025. Let me break that down just a little bit. If you chose the latest possible OPT start date, that would be, as we say here, July 18th, which means that a full 12 months from July 18th, 2024 is July 17th, 2025. Now, let's say that you don't apply for OPT, you're not sure you want to apply, and now you're in your 60-day grace period. It's July 1st, 2024, and you decide, yes, actually, I changed my mind. I want to apply for OPT. So USCIS, unless you apply for premium processing, which we're going to touch on that in just a little bit, USCIS, as I said, is taking about 3 months to process that application, which means you probably wouldn't hear back about your OPT application until September, October, if you add 3 months onto that July application date. The thing is that they are never going to change the latest possible end date. So you won't get approved until October, but your end date for OPT is still going to be July 17th. So you would be losing time off of the beginning of your OPT. Again, all the more reason for you to apply sooner rather than later. So some things to keep in mind when it comes to choosing your start date. You all are the ones choosing that authorization start date, and we're going to go over some factors that may influence your decision, but ultimately it's your decision. When you request that OPT I-20 from ISSA, you will need to indicate what your requested OPT start date is going to be, and we are going to recommend you for that start date. And then the end date will always be 12 months exactly after that start date. The authorization dates may be different than your actual employment dates. So what this means is that, for example, if you have a job starting in September, you would probably want to choose the latest possible OPT start date, which would be July 18th, 2024. And then the next question is, well, what happens between July 18th and my September 1st employment start date? Well, then you would need to use what's called your unemployment days. Over the course of your 12 months of OPT, you have 90 days during which you can be unemployed. So all of the time between July 18th until September 1st, those would just be taking away from your days of unemployment, those 90 days that you get. Once you submit the application to USCIS, the authorization start date cannot be changed. What we mean by that is that at the time that you request the I-20, you're going to tell us what you want those OPT days to, what you want your OPT start date to be. If you change your mind a week later and you haven't submitted anything to USCIS, we can change those dates for you. However, once you take that I-20, once you submit the application to USCIS, we can't change the requested dates on that I-20. It would be a much longer and more difficult process. And so we would really advise that at the time that you submit the application, that you are pretty certain about those OPT requested dates. Again, if you haven't submitted anything to USCIS and you change your mind about what you want your start date to be, we can change that for you on the I-20. If you have submitted your application to USCIS, we cannot change those dates. So what are some of the factors that go into making the decision for your OPT start date? The first one is the amount of flexibility you want in when you would be able to accept employment. So for example, if you choose an earlier start date, let's say you want to choose the earliest possible start date, which would be May 20th, the day after your completion date, this would give you the flexibility to begin working as soon as you have an offer. Versus if you chose a later start date, then you wouldn't be able to start working sooner than that start date, even if you were offered a position. So if you choose an earlier start date, it just gives you more flexibility in when you'd be able to start working. If you already have a job offer start date, so many of you may already have employment lined up for after you graduate, and that's great. If that's the case, you'll probably choose that start date as your requested OPT start date. It makes sense. That way you're not accruing any days of unemployment, and you can start working when your employer has asked you to. If you have travel plans or you're planning to take a break between finishing up your classes and starting a job, that's great. We love that for you. But then you'd want to choose a start date that's after you plan to be back in the United States or at the time that you plan to stop your break between classes and working and you plan to begin working. So again, if you're planning to travel outside of the US, if you already have travel plans, you would probably want your OPT start date to be after you return to the United States. And then the last bullet point here is unexpected opportunities. This usually comes up with on-campus opportunities at Notre Dame. Um, Something like, I have a job that's going to start in September, so I'm going to choose the latest possible start date. But then maybe you are talking to a faculty member at Notre Dame who has asked you to do research with them in June. Well, if you choose that latest possible start date, you will not be able to do work for them in June. Again, keep in mind, even though it's on campus, now that your program end date will have passed, it will still be considered off campus for immigration purposes. So what is an EAD card? I did reference this very briefly, but the EAD stands for Employment Authorization Document. It is a little card that looks exactly like this that you are going to get in the mail once or if you are approved for OPT. It will have the information listed here. It'll say post-completion OPT. It will have your authorized dates for OPT here. It's really important to understand that you cannot begin working before you receive this card in the mail, before you have it in your hand, and before you reach the authorization start date listed there. So, for example, just because you get the notice that you've been approved for OPT on May 1st doesn't mean you can begin working on OPT on May 1st if the authorization start date is not until June 1st, for example. So you have to have the card in hand and be within the dates listed on the card in order to be eligible for to start working on your OPT. The EAD is not a travel document by itself. So one of the things that we get a lot of questions about is this little notation here on the bottom of the EAD card. It says not valid for re-entry to the United States. What that means is that you cannot use the EAD card as a substitute for all of your other F1 travel documents. As Dulce mentioned, and what we will reiterate again to you in this presentation, is that while you're on post-OPT, you are still, in the eyes of the US government, an F1 student. You are still in F1 status. And so therefore, you'll need to carry all of the documentation. And we have a travel webpage where we list all of this for you that you can reference later, that list out all of the F1 documents that you need to carry with you if you're traveling internationally while you're on OPT. The EAD card will become one of these required travel documents once you're on post-completion OPT. It's not a travel document by itself. Once you are approved for OPT and before you receive the EAD card, you're likely going to get what's called an approval notice, an I-797. What this means is that USCIS has approved your OPT application. It is important to understand that that approval notice is not the same as this EAD card. Just having an approval notice does not give you work authorization. Just having the approval notice does not substitute the EAD card as a travel document. And then, of course, once you get the EAD card in the mail, like you should with any important document, you should review it to make sure that it's correct, that everything looks correct based on the information that you submitted with your OPT application on that I-765. If there's something incorrect, if they spell your name wrong, if your dates are incorrect, if this category information says something besides C3B, and we're going to get into that in a second, but C3B is the code for post-completion OPT. If any of that information is incorrect, we would advise you to contact our office as soon as possible so that we can give you instructions for getting it corrected. So travel and OPT. A lot of questions we get are around, well, how will my OPT application impact my ability to travel? And the very first one that comes to mind that is actually not listed here is spring break travel. So many of you may already have international travel plans for spring break, and we want to reiterate that it's okay for you to apply for OPT in February, and then you'll still be able to travel for spring break. That is assuming that you have all of your other valid documents, a valid F1 visa, and all of that. Your spring break will not impact your OPT application and vice versa. But other matters that have to do with travel and your OPT application, specifically after your I-20 end date, there are some restrictions on travel with a pending OPT application. So first of all, after the I-20 program end date, again, for many of you, that is going to be May 19th of 2024. If you have not submitted your OPT application by that date, If you depart the United States and you haven't applied for OPT, this will complete your F1 status. You will lose your eligibility to apply for OPT. You can remain in the US for your grace period, and then you can depart, but just note that then your F1 record is done. You're not eligible to get that OPT back. Your F1 status will be over. After the I-20 program end date, if you have a pending post-completion OPT application, this is where I really want all of you to pay attention. If you have this pending OPT application, we do not advise that you travel. And the reason for this is because you're kind of in this no man's land when your I-20 program end date has been reached and you haven't been approved for OPT yet. It means you have no classes to come back to the US to complete, neither have you been approved for OPT. And so it's just a really risky time for you to be outside of the United States. And it would also increase the risk of you not being able to get back into the United States if you were to try to return after the program end date before you have that EAD card in hand. As I mentioned, that EAD card becomes a required travel document when you're on OPT. The other reason is that USCIS could potentially follow up with you on your application. And if you're outside of the US, it just increases the chance that you're not going to be able to respond to their RFE or request for evidence in a timely manner. And they do give you a deadline to respond. So anyway, for all of those reasons, if it is after the I-20 end date and you have a pending application, meaning it has not yet been approved, you do not have your EAD card, we do not advise travel. If it is after your program end date and your post-completion OPT has been approved, you have your EAD card with you, you are good for travel as long as you carry all of the required F1 documents. Again, we have an entire travel webpage dedicated to letting you know what those travel documents are. And I want to confirm that that is even if it is after your I-20 program end date and before your employment has officially begun. You are still eligible to return to the United States with that EAD card. Just something to consider, this little note at the bottom of the slide. If your F1 visa has expired or will be expiring soon, we would recommend waiting until your OPT is approved before you depart the United States for any of your travel plans. So please just always, as we have advised you since the beginning of your program, anytime you're planning to travel internationally, check the validity of all of those documents, especially the F1 visa, which has to be valid in order for you to come back to the United States if you've been traveling internationally. If your F1 visa is expired or will be expiring, we recommend that you wait until after you have your EAD card, your OPT has been approved, before you travel to renew it. So now we have a couple of examples of different student situations that we've come across to kind of help you think about maybe where you might fall in one of these situations. So the first one, our student Young, he has a job offer. The start date of the job is May 25th. His visa is valid through May 19th of 2024, and he wants to visit his home country in the next year. So basically, we want to think, what are some of the questions that we need to be asking ourselves? So he has the job offer. The start date is May 25th. He has a valid visa and he wants to travel home. In this case, we would say that as long as he gets approved for OPT or he travels before his program end date, he'll be fine. If he gets approved for OPT before his employment start date, he could potentially travel after his program end date and before his OPT employment begins. Our next student wants to return to their home country to work after graduation and doesn't plan to apply for OPT. This is fine. As I mentioned, you have a 60-day grace period following your program end date. The student would be allowed to remain in the US for 60 days and then could depart the United States. Their F1 record would end, and it's totally fine that they have not applied for OPT. I do also want to note that if you apply for OPT and ultimately decide that you don't want to use it, you get a better job outside of the United States and you plan to depart the US and end your F1 status, that's fine. Please communicate that with ISSA, but that would also be completely fine. Our next student, Claire, does not have an offer of employment, but is looking for jobs. She has an expired visa and does not plan to travel. So in this case, if Claire doesn't have a job offer, Claire might choose the latest possible OPT start date to maximize the amount of time that she has to look for a job, since she doesn't have one already. It also seems that she doesn't have any travel plans, so it's okay that her visa is expired. She's still maintaining her status in the United States, and her travel is not going to impact her OPT application since she doesn't have international travel plans. And then our final student, Fatima, has a job offer with a start date of September 1st, wants to go home until August 15th, and has a valid visa through August 30th. So if her visa is going to be valid at the time that she plans to come back on August 15th, that would be fine, as long as she has the EAD card in hand after the program end date. She would be fine for travel in this scenario. And then if she has her employment start date as September 1st, she would likely choose September 1st as the EAD, I'm sorry, the OPT requested start date.
Actually, Zena, can you go back there real quick?
Yes.
I'm sorry. There's just two things I wanted to say is that the start date couldn't be September 1st. It means that she's going to be using unemployment. It sounded like you were saying the authorization start date. So her employment start date could be September 1st. Her authorization start date is still going to be that last July 18th date. So she's using up unemployment, but there's no harm in that. The other thing I would just point out with Ahan is that we like to remind students that even if you think or your friends tell you they're not going to apply for OPT, they're just going to go back home. Once you exit, you cannot call us in October and say that you want to use your OPT after all. We just had a student who applied for OPT, left the US, and did not use his OPT and called us in January because now he wants to use it. So whether you plan not to use it and you don't apply, you plan not to use it, but you apply just in case, you still have to begin using it within those unemployment days. So I just wanted to clarify that on those two.
Yes, super helpful. And again, just kind of reiterating that the employment start date may not necessarily align with your OPT start date, but that the difference between those dates would just use those days of unemployment. So that leads us into our next slide about unemployment and OPT. I'm actually going to turn it back over to Dulce.
Thank you, Zaina. So as Zaina's mentioned before, while you're on OPT, you're allowed 90 cumulative days of unemployment built into your 12 months of work authorization. And so essentially what that means is that your employment must begin by the 90th day and must also be reported. Reporting is something super important, and we'll touch on that a little bit later in the next few slides. But again, you need to make sure that you begin employment by the 90th day and that you report it to ISSA or SEBP. So for example, if you chose an authorization start date of July 18th, you should have planned on beginning employment and reporting that by October 16th, so as to not accumulate any unemployment dates. Your unemployment dates begin on the date on your EAD card. So if your EAD card start date says May 20th and you are not employed by May 25th, you've already accumulated 5 days of unemployment dates. Or if you began work on May 20th but forgot to report, then you will have already accumulated those days of unemployment. Vacation days, holidays, weekends, none of that counts as unemployment as long as you're employed. So if you have a position and they give you a holiday or a day off, that's okay. That does not count against you. But if you are not employed, weekends and holidays and any normal weekday will count towards your unemployment dates. It's also, I'll mention one more time again, that you cannot work on campus, on the lab, or any kind of on-campus employment once your program end date has been reached. You cannot do any kind of work on that until you have your EAD card in hand. What kind of employment is allowed during OPT? So there, it's kind of flexible in comparison to the STEM OPT. You can have a regular paid employment. You can work for a company or a firm and have a regular employment. You can have multiple employers. You can have an employer in the morning, a different employer in the afternoon, a different employer on the weekends. You can have multiple employments. You can work independent contractor positions. You can even be self-employed. We just want to note that you should report all the employment that you're going to be working, and that you keep proper documentation of all of the employment. You can also work through an employment agency. Your position can be paid or unpaid, so as long as it's not violating any labor laws. But remember, it must be related to your field of study. Special notes about unemployment. For the purposes of OPT, USCIS considers more than 20 hours per week as full-time employment, regardless of the position is paid or unpaid. They consider 20 hours plus as full-time employment. If you are working under OPT, you are allowed to work remotely. So as long as you're not working remotely indefinitely, and you also don't want to work remotely for a non-US based employer if you're in the United States. And you also don't want to work in the outside of the United States for somebody that has a US based employer. So I'm going to repeat that. You do not want to you want to be physically in the United States working remotely for a non-US based employer. OPT is work authorization for the US while you are in the US by a US based employer. Hope I did not confuse you too much there. Okay, next slide. We talk a lot about how your OPT should be related to your field of study. And this is super important because you are going to be reporting this to your SEVP. You're going to be reporting this to your immigration record. And you need to explain how your employment ties to your field of study. And so there's two examples here. One, a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, and then another one, a bachelor's degree who's applying for a position in business. And so the second example gives a really good detailed explanation of what the company is, of the courses that they have used that are beneficial to this particular degree. What are the responsibilities that they have? They list the company, they list the title, and then how they're going to, and how that ties to their major field of study. So the second paragraph is a good example of all the details that would be helpful for you to give, that it's not a vague example, that is very detailed when it comes to reporting your employment and how that ties to your field of study.
And I just want to mention, sorry, Dulce, I just want to mention that ISSA is not going to be investigating you to confirm that the work you're doing is related to your major field of study. It is all self-reported, but the important thing to understand is that if for whatever reason USCIS were to follow up with you about something that you reported in terms of your employment, you should feel comfortable explaining how the work that you're doing is related to the degree that you just got from Notre Dame. So just want to confirm, ISSA is not the one like judging you for this, but you should feel comfortable explaining that connection.
Thank you, Sena. So we talk a lot about the responsibilities that you have while you're on OPT. And so we'll briefly go over some of those responsibilities. You should plan on reporting your address, your employment changes. If you have new employment, if you have changes in your employment, if you end your employment, it is important that you update us within 10 days of that change. You also want to monitor your unemployment dates so that you don't exceed them. CVIS can typically terminate your CVIS record if they notice that you have way too much unemployment, even if you are employed. But if you neglect to report that, they will never know. Monitor your work eligibility. Remember, do not begin working until the date on your EAD card, and make sure that your employment is related to your field of study. And make sure that you are continuing to pursue appropriate employment. Again, I'll reiterate again, the dates on your EAD card, that start date has been reached and that it is related to your field of study. Where do you report? So we mentioned lots of reporting. There's two ways that you can report your OPT employment and any changes. You'll have access to your SEVP portal once you're approved for OPT. You'll get an email and you'll be able to set up an account where you can see your the information. Essentially, everything that can be seen on CVIS is essentially what's being recorded, and you have the access to make those changes there. This is where you'll also write that paragraph of what you are doing and how it relates to your field of study. You can also report via ISSA link. You are already used to ISSA link. You have been using ISSA link your time here. You will use that to report your employment, to change addresses. If you decide to end your F1 status, or if you change to a different status, you'll report that there. You'll request your STEM OPT I-20 if you're eligible, or if there's any updates to your I-20 that you need while on OPT, you can also access it there. You'll want to notify ISSA, notify us. Remember, we are still continuing to support you while you're on OPT. Continue to notify us if you depart, continue to notify us if there's any changes. If you decide to begin a new academic program before the end of your OPT, you'll want to let us know. And also important to note that at that point, your OPT will end if you're going to begin a new full-time academic program. We typically advise that you submit your reporting through ISSA link, because we are able to catch things that might be technicalities. Perhaps you put in the date wrong. Perhaps the form didn't completely submit when you're reporting on SAVP. Perhaps the paragraph and the description of how your employment ties to your major field of study is very vague. And if you report on ISSA link, we will be able to catch that. So we encourage you to use ISSA link, and then just use your SAVP portal to double check and to review for accurate information. If you are STEM eligible, you'll only be able to report on ISSA link. So it might just be something that you're just getting used to. Continue to report on ISSA link. Once you leave the University of Notre Dame, however, you might lose access to ISSA link, and you won't be able to access this with your regular Okta login. Zena, would you go to the next slide, please? And so we have instructions on our website on how to access ISSA link after you graduate. You're going to need your Notre Dame ID, so don't lose that. You'll need that ID number, and you're going to be directed to a different page that's going to essentially ask for your Notre Dame ID number and your date of birth, and then you'll request a PIN, and that's the PIN that you'll use to access ISSA link after graduation. And if you have any trouble with that, feel free to reach out to let us know. And again, the instructions are also on our website. Pass that back to Zena.
Yes, back to me. And just a quick note about reporting, that you report to either the SAVP portal or to ISSA link. You do not have to do both. Just want to confirm that. So moving on to the process of formally requesting your OPT I-20 and filing that I-765. So once again, you've already seen this kind of visual of the process in a nutshell, but we also put some of the screenshots here that might help as you're kind of working your way through this process. So as we've mentioned, that first step is requesting that I-20. You're going to do that in ISSA link, which Dulce just mentioned. When you log into your ISSA link, it's going to look like the screenshot in the bottom left corner. You'll see there's an F1 practical training panel, or you'll see that there's an F1 practical training button in the left side panel. And then you'll see there is the request form to request the OPT I-20. So when we talk about requesting that I-20, that's where you're going to do it. We're going to walk you through it at the end of this presentation too. And then we talked about once you have the I-20 and you've got your documents and you're formally filing that I-765 to create that My USCIS account, we link you to it on our OPT webpage, and it will be in the approval email when we send you your I-20, but this is kind of what that website's going to look like when you access it. And then you're monitoring your application, and then hopefully the final step is that it gets approved and you get that EAD card. And as you mentioned, this is just a little visual of what that card is going to look like. And it is an actual physical card that you're going to get in the mail. We said a lot of this information is going to be repetitive, but we just want to make sure that that we're saying it in as many ways as possible to just really make sure that you all feel confident in what this is going to look like from start to finish. So requesting that I-20 with the DSO recommendation. So as we've mentioned, this OPT application process is really two parts. And the first part is with ISSA, where we recommend you for OPT. As I said, that recommendation comes in the form of a new I-20, your OPT I-20. However, the second part is with USCIS, with the US government, who is formally authorizing you for the work authorization. And when we say filing the I-765, you're filing the I-765 with USCIS. So it's two parts. We mentioned this before, but the recommendation that we give you, which when I say recommendation, all of you, your page 2 of the I-20 looks almost exactly like this right now. If you have it with you, you can take a look on page 2. However, right now, under employment authorizations, there will be nothing there. It's going to be blank. Once you get your OPT I-20 from ISSA, it's going to look like this. It's going to say post-completion OPT requested, and then it's going to have the dates that you requested for your OPT to start. And then the end date will, of course, be exactly 12 months from that date. So you'll be able to know that that's your OPT I-20 because it will look like this on page 2. That recommendation, again, valid for 30 days. If you're getting close to that 30-day mark and you haven't applied for OPT yet, please come back to us so that we can give you a new I-20 to facilitate your application. Any application, any I-765 application to USCIS that is filed after the 30 days of that I-20 recommendation, it's going to be automatically denied. And again, this happens to students every single year. So please keep track of that. Put a note on your calendar. That way you know if you still haven't applied for OPT and it's been 30 days, you need to come back and talk to ISSA. All right. So filing that form I-765. So again, let's say that you've gotten that I-20 from ISSA, you've got all your documents and you're ready to file online with USCIS. So of course, when you receive the I-20, this will be in the approval email as well, but just a general reminder to print and sign the I-20 with the OPT recommendation. So you'll get that new OPT I-20, print it out and hand sign it. You should never be electronically signing your own I-20s. You need to print it out, hand sign it with a pen, and then you'll need to scan it to have an electronic copy that you use to file for the OPT application. So prepare your electronic documents because you're going to be filing this application online. So what are those documents that you need to have in order to apply for OPT? So the first one is that I-20 that you just got from ISSA. You've printed it out, you've signed it, you've scanned it. Now you have an electronic copy. You're going to need the passport bio page. So that first page of your passport that has your picture on it, it can be in color or black and white, however you have the scan, but you will need that bio page, a scan of that you'll have to have that for your OPT application. You will need a 2x2 color passport style photo that meets the US guidelines. When you're in the online I-765 application, there will be a link to show you what those US guidelines are for a passport photo. And if you're worried about your passport photo meeting the requirements, there will be there's a link in the I-765 to show you kind of what those requirements are and to see if your photo meets those guidelines. Your most recent I-94 record. So hopefully all of you have access to your most recent I-94 record. Many of you who traveled over the winter break have got a new I-94 record when you came back to campus in January. So you'll have your most recent I-94 record that shows that you entered as an F1 student and also says D/S. Any I-20s that you've had previously, if you have been authorized for CPT, you'll need to have access to those I-20s. There will be a place in the application for you to upload those I-20s. If you've never had CPT, that's totally fine. You will not have to upload anything in that section. I will note that the online I-765 application is broken up into different sections, and it's very clear where you're going to have to upload all of these documents. And of course, if you have questions, you'll be able to come talk to ISSA before you submit, but it will be much clearer when you're actually in the system completing that application. If any of you have previously been issued an EAD card, let's say that you are currently completing a master's degree or a PhD, but you previously completed a bachelor's degree in the United States and you applied for OPT based off of your bachelor's degree, you should submit a copy of your EAD card from the previous OPT that you were approved for. Again, if you've never had OPT in the US, you've never been issued an EAD card, you will not have to upload anything in that section. And then finally, you'll need to have your credit card information for the online payment. The I-765 payment, the filing fee is $410. $410. And we are going to touch on what premium processing is, but potentially if you choose to apply for premium processing, there will be an additional fee that you'll have to pay. And we're going to cover that in just a second. But regardless of whether you file for premium processing or not, you will need to pay that $410 fee as the final step before submitting your I-765 application. This will all be done through the USCIS account. As we mentioned, you'll create the free account, and then that will facilitate your ability to complete that form I-765. And then we said this at the beginning, but you'll be able to monitor the status and the progress of your application through that portal. So it'll tell you once your application has been received, when it's processing, when they're issuing your EAD card, if they've approved the application, you'll be able to monitor that through that USCIS portal once you've submitted the I-765. So premium processing, what is premium processing? Essentially, premium processing means that you can pay a fee, a very large fee in this case, so that USCIS will adjudicate your I-765 application guaranteed in 30 days. I want to confirm that this ensures a decision about your authorization in 30 days, but it doesn't guarantee an approval, and it doesn't mean 30 days until you have your EAD card in your hand. Once they approve or deny, hopefully approve the application, there is still time that they need to mail you that EAD card. But just to confirm, it ensures a decision in 30 days if you file for premium processing. I will note that that currently the processing time for the I-765 without premium processing is approximately 3 to 3.5 months. You can apply for premium processing with your I-765 application or after you've already submitted the I-765. So you'll have the option of filing for it simultaneously, or if you've been waiting for 2 weeks and you change your mind and you decide that you want to apply for premium processing, you can still go back and file for premium processing to get that decision in 30 days. Currently, the fee for premium processing is $1,500. But very important, on February 26th, they just recently announced that this fee will be increasing to $1,685. We recognize that that is a lot of money. Please understand that that fee is in addition to the $410 filing fee that you will be paying just to file the I-765. So premium processing is separate. If you have specific questions about that, feel free to touch base with us either after the presentation or later on. But it is in addition to that $410 filing fee. So USCIS process notes. So first, contact ISSA immediately if you receive notification that your application was either denied or rejected. Additionally, if you receive a request for evidence, which is essentially a follow-up from USCIS on your application, basically, if you receive anything from USCIS that is not an approval, we want to support you. And so please contact us immediately so that we can advise you on next steps. And again, immediately being a very key part of this, because there's only a certain amount of time during which you can apply for OPT. And we want to make sure that you get access to this benefit. So contact ISSA immediately if you receive anything that is not an approval. Once again, we want to reiterate that an approval notice, if you are approved for OPT, the approval notice is not work authorization. So just because you get notification that your application was approved, it doesn't mean that you can immediately start working. Only the EAD card authorizes you to begin working in the United States, and it has the authorization start date on it. And just to confirm, when you get hired to work on your OPT, you will have to present this EAD card to your employer's HR in order to be formally hired. So you'll have to have that in hand. USCIS does not guarantee processing times or assist if the timeline is within normal processing times, which means that if the normal processing time for USCIS, which as I said, I believe right now is about 3.5 months, if your application has been pending for 2 months and you're like, hey, I want to know what's going on, where's my EAD card, you can try to call them. They will probably tell you that they cannot do anything to assist you because it's still within normal processing times. So just do not have high expectations if you're trying to contact USCIS regarding a status update on your application, and they are not helpful. If it's within the normal processing times, they will probably not provide you with any further information. Premium processing is available at any point in the process. So again, you can file it at the same time that you apply for OPT, at the same time that you file the I-765, or you can file for premium processing later on, once your I-765 has already been pending. And then just a final note, it only guarantees a decision on the application. It does not guarantee an approval. So we mentioned at the beginning that we would touch on some of the common mistakes. So first of all, don't file the I-765 early. These are common mistakes because they are common, because we've seen students almost every year make these mistakes and have it impact, sometimes detrimentally, their OPT, their eligibility for OPT, or their ability to start working on time. And so please pay very close attention to these mistakes. Do not file the I-765 early. We have told you that you can submit the request for the OPT I-20 today, January 29th, but that does not change that the earliest possible date you can file your application is 90 days before your program end date. So again, just to confirm, for those of you graduating on May 19th, February 19th is that 90th day. You cannot file the OPT application before February 19th, even though you have all of the documentation to do it. So please just keep that in the back of your mind. You cannot file earlier than the 90th day. It will be automatically rejected. You will not be refunded the money that you pay. Choose the correct eligibility category, which is for post-OPT C3B. This will make more sense when you're asked to input it on the I-765 application. It's going to ask you what category of work authorization you're applying for. It's very important because we have a lot of students every year who put, or not a lot, but some students who put C3A, which is the category for pre-completion OPT. All of you are applying for work authorization for after you graduate, which means you are applying for post-completion OPT, not pre-completion OPT. Just because you're applying for the work authorization now while you're still, while you are before your graduation, that doesn't mean that you're applying for pre-completion OPT. If you're applying for work authorization that is after your program end date, you're applying for post-completion OPT, and that code is C3B. Very important. If you file the I-765 within 30, I'm sorry, you should file the I-765 within 30 days of ISSA's recommendation in CVIS. That is the day that we issue you your OPT I-20. If you file the I-765 with an I-20, even if it has the OPT recommendation on it, if we gave you that I-20 more than 30 days in the past, that will be an automatic denial of that OPT application. Again, you will not get a refund for the money that you paid for that application. Please check that. That is a very big one. It got a lot of students this past year. And lastly, sign the I-20 after printing it and before uploading it to the I-765. First of all, don't forget to not sign the I-20. A lot of students we give them the I-20 and then they upload it as is to their I-765 application. You need to sign it first. That's what really validates it. You print it out, you sign in ink, and then you scan it so that you have an electronic copy to use to file the I-765. So the 24-month STEM extension, as Dulce mentioned, this session is strictly about post-completion OPT, but we know that many of you have questions about the STEM extension now. We have a whole webpage about the STEM OPT extension that goes in detail through the eligibility criteria and the process. For right now, what's important to understand about the STEM OPT application process is that all of you, even if you are in a major that is STEM eligible, all of you are only applying for your first 12 months of OPT, post-completion OPT. You're not applying for all 3 years right now. So when you get that I-20, the OPT I-20, it is going to recommend you for 1 year of OPT, and that is correct. You are only applying for your first 12 months right now. If you are in a field that is STEM eligible, and if you're not sure what that means, you can take a look at our STEM webpage. If you are STEM eligible, you will not begin the process of applying for STEM OPT until 90 days before the end of your post-completion OPT. So about a year from now is when you'll start thinking about that STEM OPT application process. And just to confirm, STEM OPT is a separate application from post-OPT, as I mentioned. It will require another $410 filing fee since you will be filing the I-765 again for the STEM extension. But just to confirm, you are only focusing on the first year of OPT for now. And then we get a lot of questions around H-1B. If some of you may have employers who are simultaneously sponsoring you for the H-1B visa category at the same time that you're applying for OPT. So just to kind of answer some of those questions, can you apply simultaneously for H-1B and OPT? Yes, these are separate applications to USCIS, and they don't conflict with each other. So you'll work with your employer who's sponsoring you for that H-1B petition, and then you will work with ISSA to file for OPT, which is a benefit of your F1 status. We always recommend that you maintain your F1 status until you have the approval for a new visa category. But once you have an approval for another visa category, in this case, an H-1B, for example, please let ISSA know so that we can advise you on next steps with your F1 record. If you get picked in the H-1B lottery, when would your status change? The start date for most H-1B lottery petitions, meaning that your application has to go through the lottery system first, is October 1st of a given year, of any given year. So this says 2023. In this year, of course, it would be October 1st, 2024. And if you're chosen in the lottery, we recommend that you reach out to us when you have the approval notice, again, so that we can make sure that your F1 record is updated. I want to confirm that these are just commonly asked questions about how the F1 status interacts with the H-1B. We at ISSA do not advise on the H-1B visa category. We are strictly concerned with your F1 status associated with the University of Notre Dame. But this is just to answer some of the questions we know some of you have. Do I need to work for my H-1B employer while on OPT? You do not. These are completely separate applications. Again, if you have questions about that H-1B application and your employment for the employer sponsoring you for H-1B, please refer to that employer and their legal counsel who can advise you on that application. Again, ISSA is only able to advise you on the OPT application and the impact on your F1 status. Other types of US employment authorization. So again, we know some of you have these questions kind of rolling around. How can I keep working in the US after my OPT expires? Just to put it out there, there is no guarantee that you'll be able to continue working after your OPT expires. For those of you that are in a STEM eligible major field of study, you will be eligible for that 24-month extension in addition to the 1 year of post-OPT. But after that, or for those of you who are not in a STEM field, there's no guarantee that you'll be able to continue working after the end of your OPT. If you're in conversation with your employer about potential sponsorship or perhaps your own immigration attorney, that is between you and them. Again, ISSA can't advise you on other employment pathways. What are other kinds of employment authorization? So they are limited in the US. And again, we would definitely advise that you consult with your own immigration attorney if you're wondering about other options after F1 status. But we do provide a video on our webpage. Leah, if you don't mind, or Dulce putting it in the chat so that they can access it. But we provide that as a resource. Again, if you have specific questions about your particular situation, it may be best to consult with your own immigration attorney. And then lastly, what are my options after OPT? Potentially getting sponsorship for another employment-based immigration status, like the H-1B, for example. Some of you may choose to start another education program, another degree program. So you may choose to transfer your F1 record from Notre Dame to the next place where you'll be pursuing a degree. That's a possibility. Or potentially exiting the United States. Many of you will decide to just go back to your home country, and no matter what you decide with any of this, just be sure to communicate with ISSA, again, so that we can support you and make sure that your F1 record is up to date. So finally, special notes. Dependents. For those of you who have spouses or children that are in the United States with you, please note that they will still remain in F2 status because you are still in F1 status while you're on OPT. Their program end date will be adjusted automatically when we recommend you for OPT. So their F2 status is entirely based on your ability to maintain your F1 status. So their I-20s will automatically extend as well. Once we issue you your new I-20, we will issue them new I-20s as well. The visa sponsor on OPT. So again, we said this before, even though you're no longer enrolled in classes at Notre Dame, you are still an F1 student in the eyes of the US government, and your status is still sponsored by the University of Notre Dame, which means that all of your immigration questions related to your F1 status and maintaining your status while on OPT are still going to be directed to ISSA. And as Dulce mentioned, you still have full access to ISSA while you're on OPT. You have access to our advising resources, our webpage. We will send you email reminders, all of that stuff. So please stay in communication with us. Please continue to read our emails. They are relevant to you, even as a student on OPT. So USCIS, in terms of employment, USCIS counts full-time employment as more than 20 hours per week, but students can report short-term employment of even 1 day. If you're doing something like a gig or like contract work, short-term employment, as long as it is related to your major field of study, you should report that employment on OPT, even if it is short-term. And again, that 20 hours per week is in total. So maybe you have 2 jobs. One of them is 10 hours a week, another one is 15 hours a week. That's fine. You're meeting that at least 20 hours per week requirement. So you should be reporting all of that employment. And then lastly, just reiterating that since you are still an F1 student sponsored by the University of Notre Dame, ISSA is the office that you should direct all of your immigration questions to as they pertain to your F1 status and your OPT, your time on OPT, your employment on OPT, your reporting responsibilities on OPT. All of that information is coming from ISSA. So Dulce is going to take it back to go over some FAQs.
What is your status while on OPT? Sana just finished talking about this. Your status while on OPT is still F1 status, so you're still being sponsored by the University of Notre Dame. I am a STEM designated major. Don't I apply for 3 years of OPT instead of 1 year? As a STEM designated major, you are eligible for 3 years of OPT. However, you will be filing 2 different applications with USCIS, one for OPT, post-OPT, and then another one when the time comes for a STEM OPT. So 2 separate applications, 2 separate fees, 2 separate work authorizations, one for 12 months and another one for 24 months. Can you change your OPT dates later on? This is an interesting question because the answers can vary. So if you requested your OPT I-20 from ISSA and you have not filed with USCIS and you've thought about it a little bit more and you want to update those dates, you can definitely submit another request and we will give you another I-20 so that you can submit your application. But if you've already submitted your application to USCIS and perhaps USCIS has not yet processed it and it's still requested, we can definitely ask to have those dates changed. But remember, we are dealing with USCIS, and so that might delay you a little bit more than you have time to be approved. And if USCIS has already approved your OPT and the dates are already printed on your EAD card and the date has already begun, there isn't necessarily a way that we can change those OPT dates. So just be very strategic about choosing those dates so that you can get the best use out of it. What are the chances that my OPT application is denied? The vast majority of our students will get approved. The denials might come from a technicality. Zaina mentioned before, perhaps you use the I-20 after the 30 days that we have given it to you. Sometimes students don't sign their own signature on page 1 of their I-20. Maybe there's a typo, some kind of small minuscule technicality is what would typically get denied. But for the most part, if you fill out your applications, you should be okay. How do you know when you are authorized to work on OPT? your EAD card, the employment authorization documents, has those dates listed, and you are only allowed to work on the dates listed on your EAD card. What if I find a job that is not related to my major? The entire purpose of OPT is that it is related to your field of study. So unfortunately, if you have an opportunity that does not relate to your major at all, this is an opportunity that you'll have to turn down.
Just a quick note that all of these questions and even more questions are on our webpage. Leah is going to put the link to our OPT FAQ webpage in the chat. And so if you are wanting to refer back or maybe have other questions, I would highly encourage you to look at that webpage first, because it's going to answer probably a lot of the questions, not only that we have here, others as well.
I will also say that if your application is denied, then by all means reach out to ISSA. We will be happy to help you figure out the denial and help you how to continue the process. So please do reach out. Just to wrap it up, just a few of the takeaways from today's session. Remembering that you are an F1 visa holder, you're the one that is driving this process. You're the ones that are choosing the dates. You're the ones that are choosing the employments and looking for employments, doing the reporting and the communicating. So by all means, know that this is a responsibility that it's yours, and we are just here to help you with the process. Also, USCIS does not guarantee processing times. I know Zena has touched on the subject as well, and nor do they communicate with applicants unless they have requested for further evidence. They will not be able to communicate. So it's not an easy phone number where you can reach out to check on the status. The best place to see that will be under on the My USCIS account that you create. You also remember, don't need a job offer to apply for OPT. You're just going to choose your date strategically, but if you're not employed, it's not the end of the world. You will have enough time, hopefully enough time, utilizing some of those unemployment dates if you have to apply for a position. And again, one more time, your F1 status is tied to Notre Dame, and we are going to continue to support you throughout your time while you're on OPT or STEM OPT if you're eligible. So please communicate, continue to communicate with ISSA. And to reiterate just a few of the steps that you're going to go, some of the steps that you learned, if you take nothing else from us, then these are the steps that you need to be following to apply for OPT. You're going to request your I-20 with OPT recommendations. And this is not something that we will just automatically give you. I know some of the questions on the Q&A were about us automatically giving you that I-20. No, you will need to request your I-20 with OPT recommendation. Your advisor will sign off on them. You're going to gather all your documents, electronic copies, because you're going to be filing online. You're going to create your USCIS account to get ready to file. You can complete your application. We will be happy to see it and give a courtesy review. But you can complete it before you file it. And when the date hits, when it's time for you to go ahead and submit that application, make a little note on your calendar, put it on a Post-it note, on your bathroom mirror, or however it is that you're going to remember to go ahead and file. Remember, we want to make sure that you file as early as possible so that you don't experience any delays. Meet with us, meet with all the advisors here, myself, Zena, Leah, I believe Elaine is also on this session. We want to help you. We want to make sure that you have a successful OPT application process and OPT authorization period. And so we are happy to help you. No question is too big. No question is too small. We want to make sure that you have all the information. So at the bottom of the slide is ways that you can contact us. And again, remember, we are still supporting you through your OPT. So please reach out. Make sure that we have your email address once you graduate to make sure that we continue communication. And best of luck in your OPT filing.
So, oh, Zaina, go ahead.
No, go for it. I was going to start with some of the questions. I got a lot of direct messages.
Yeah. So let me start with some of the ones that actually went into the Q&A though, and a few that have been maybe a little bit repetitive. And you guys are amazing with, I think we've had at least 75 questions across some different tools. Once we are done kind of going over some of these Q&As, if you want to stay on and you have any questions about the actual form and ISSA link, we can show that and walk you through that. and we'll spend some more time. So the questions we're answering will be what have already been submitted. The first one I want to start with, Zaina, is does all of the information you just went over also apply to our Canadian citizens?
Oh, do you want me to answer it?
Yeah, you're going to answer. I'll just ask the questions you can answer.
Yes, so the answer is yes. Even if you are a Canadian national, you are presumably still in F1 status. If you entered in F1 status, you should check your I-94 record to confirm. If you are studying, then you should be in F1 status. But yes, that all applies to Canadians, all students in F1 status. The only thing that will not apply is, I think there is one part in the I-765 that lets you upload a copy of your visa stamp as one of the possible options. In that case, if you're a Canadian, you will upload one of the other documents, but everything else will apply to our Canadian nationals.
We have another question from a law student who it probably has a similar situation to a lot of our law students and to maybe our finance students who have a CPA exam. And she says, I plan to graduate in May and then stay in the US to study for the bar exam and take that exam in July. I will not start my job until September. Based on everything that we've talked about, does this impact my application timeline? What does this mean for start dates? All of this.
If you are applying for OPT to pursue that job in the US in September, then you are legally allowed to remain in the meantime between the end of your program, as long as you apply for OPT, and you'll be able to stay to take the bar exam. The other thing that I want to mention for those of you who are in the law school who may potentially plan to not work under your OPT and potentially leave the US to pursue jobs outside of the US, if you wanted to leave and return, you can sit for the bar in a tourist visa status. But if you are planning to apply for OPT to work in the US, then yes, you'd be able to sit for the bar if you remained in the US and continue to maintain status.
We also had a number of questions about the address to use and a lot of concerns about maybe it won't come in time, the lease will be over. USPS is not, doesn't always take responsibility if a card is lost. Could you address kind of those general concerns?
Yes, I saw that come in some of my direct messages as well. So that's a great question, and it is something that we get asked very frequently. And you are absolutely correct that USPS is probably not going to take responsibility for a lost EAD card. And the problem with that is that you will likely have to apply for a new replacement EAD card, which is a lot of money and a lot of time wasted. The best way to avoid that is if you either you know the address that you are going to be moving to within 3 months time of completing your program at Notre Dame, you can potentially list that. What I would advise is if you have anybody that you trust that lives even outside of Indiana, anywhere in the United States, that has a more stable address that will be valid for at least 3 months into the future, I would go ahead and list that address as when you're filing the I-765, it's going to ask you for your physical US address, and it's going to ask you for a US mailing address. So it's okay for those to be different. And so for that mailing address, I would highly recommend, if you're not sure that you're going to be in your current address for at least 3 months after you graduate, I would highly recommend putting the address of a trusted friend, potentially family member, that lives even elsewhere in the United States that has a more stable address.
And we'll also just note last year for our students who applied on the earliest possible date, most of them got their cards before the end of the semester. The students who waited to apply even as late as mid-March were waiting the 3.5 months. And so Notre Dame, we have a real advantage with this early graduation date that you're getting ahead of the other 70,000 OPT applications that USCIS is receiving. So it's another reason that we want to encourage you to apply early, even though, of course, that's never guaranteed. That processing time is never guaranteed. If you want to go ahead and take one of yours, Dana, while I look for the next one.
Yes, I was also just going to add, though, regarding the US address, is that if you list your current address as your mailing address, and within a few weeks of submitting that OPT application, you realize that actually you're planning to move, that address is not going to be valid, the first thing that I would recommend doing is contacting your landlord potentially at your apartment, just in case it gets delivered. Potentially, they could pull it aside and forward it to your new address. I will also note that federal mail is oftentimes not allowed to be forwarded, so that's not a foolproof method. But it is, if you're, if there's no other option, that may be something to do. The other thing is that there is an option to update your address with USCIS in your My USCIS account by completing the AR-11. That is what the formal document is. Again, there's no guarantee that that AR-11 request to change your address is going to be processed before your OPT application gets processed. So that is also a risk, but something else that you might try if you're in that kind of between a rock and a hard place. That is something else that you might choose to do. Yes, I have. So is it possible to send the application to USCIS later in the process if we intend to pay the $1,500 fee for a faster process? So that came up a few times. And the answer is yes, but we wouldn't necessarily advise it. Again, our best advice is for all of you to apply as early as possible. We understand that there are several reasons that you may be delayed in submitting that application. You may be waiting to hear back from grad school before you decide to pay this $410. But yes, if the premium processing fee is not a problem, if it's realistic for you to pay that fee on top of the $410, then technically, yes, you can wait to apply, and then you'd have the advantage of getting your application adjudicated again within 30 days. The one thing that I will note, though, because this message specifically referenced the $1,500 fee, just note that on February 26th, that is going up to that $1,685. So it will be slightly higher if you're applying after February 26th, which it seems like would be the case if this is what you're asking. But ultimately, yes, you could apply later if you're planning to apply for premium processing. Is the process for post-OPT different than pre-OPT? Yes, in the sense that it's a separate application, but much of the process in terms of requesting your OPT I-20 and then filing the I-765 will be very much the same. There is a part where you indicated you were applying for category C3A for pre-OPT. This will now be C3B for post-OPT. So it is a completely separate application, but it will be very similar in terms of the process of what you did for pre-OPT. Can we continue our on-campus employment? Are we still bound by 20 hours per week after receiving the OPT until our full-time employment begins? This is a really great question, and I want to answer it very carefully so that it's super clear. So can you continue your on-campus employment after receiving the OPT until your full-time employment begins? Whatever you're doing in terms of on-campus employment now will be considered off-campus employment after your program end date, after that May 19th graduation date. So actually, it will not be considered on-campus employment. You will not be able to continue. The only exception to that is if the work that you're doing on campus is related to your major field of study and you are approved for OPT, you could potentially be rehired with Notre Dame under your OPT, and you could continue working in that way. So that is the restriction in terms of being able to continue being employed on campus. You can work at Notre Dame, but it will be considered off campus after the program end date, and you'll have to be rehired under your OPT. Again, if you graduate on May 19th and your OPT does not begin until July 1st, for example, then you cannot be working at all between May 20th until you're within your authorization period on July 1st. So please keep that in mind. In terms of are you still bound by 20 hours a week? For a student worker position, right now, when you're a matriculated student with the university, you are still bound to that 20 hours per week. Once you're on OPT, there is no cap to the number of hours per week you can work, as long as all of the work that you're doing is aligned with the OPT employment requirements, which Dulce referenced earlier. So it has to be related to your major. You have to be working at least 20 hours per week in total. So there's no cap. You can have several employers. You can work all hours of the day if you so choose, but that 20 hour per week is still in place while you're a student at Notre Dame.
Dana, I'll answer a couple while you're looking through your questions. One of them is, do employers actually sponsor OPT students? And I need them to sponsor me for OPT, or can I work at any company in the US? So this goes back to this idea that Notre Dame is still your sponsor of your F1 student status. So Notre Dame is still your sponsor while you're on OPT. You can work for any employer, right? It just has to be US based. The employment needs to be related to your major. But you are not looking for sponsorship when you are on OPT. And that's such an important question, because often students go and talk to employers and they say, do you sponsor? And you just don't need to think about sponsorship until you're at the end of your post-completion OPT or your STEM OPT extension. So great question. Notre Dame is still your sponsor. Once you have that authorization in the first 12 months of OPT, you can work. There's just a lot of flexibility about who you can work with. There are more restrictions if you're eligible to apply for the STEM OPT extension. And we'll talk about those in a future STEM OPT extension presentation. The other one is a student asked, how can I find out if I'm STEM designated? And I'm just going to put a link in the chat to our STEM OPT page. And there's a list there of all of the STEM majors. The STEM major designation is based on the CIP code under the program information on page 1. But the link I just put in the chat takes you to our STEM OPT page, and there's a link there that tells you exactly what majors at Notre Dame are STEM eligible. And then the last one that we have, and then we'll take whatever final ones you have, Zana. Otherwise, we have answered all of them in the Q&A, is can I travel after the program end date with a valid F1 visa and an EAD card in hand, even though my start date is much later before I come back to the US? That travel, we go back to that chart about travel, we put the link in the chat earlier, is the same level of risk as when you've been a student this entire time. So you just want to make sure that you don't exceed your unemployment days, that you get back to the US to begin working in the US and to report that employment. But yes, this is the chart that Zana just popped back to that tells you once that OPT is approved, you can travel freely. If you have the F1 visa, you're even in a better position. So I'll turn it back to Zana.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So the next one that I have is the EAD card says it's a work authorization document. Does it mean that when I'm applying for a job, I can say that I'm authorized to work in the US? That's a really great question. And a lot of the job applications that all of you will be completing will ask you those two questions. The first one, are you authorized to work in the United States? The second one, will you now or in the future require sponsorship? And it's very difficult because you are kind of in this gray area where you have a pending application, you've applied for OPT, you don't formally have the approval. In this case, if you've applied for OPT, I would say that you can indicate that you are authorized to work in the US because at the time that you would be working, you would have the authorization in place. However, for the second question, I would say that since OPT is not infinite, you would have to indicate for the question, would you now or in the future require sponsorship? You would need to indicate yes. However, I always tell students that it's really important to mention that this is part of a larger conversation, and especially as you get to perhaps a second interview, to have a really frank discussion with whoever you're speaking with from the company about the fact that you have this year of work authorization, potentially 3 years of work authorization, and during that time you would not need sponsorship. And also to confirm that you have applied for OPT, but that you are waiting for the formal authorization, because that will also dictate when you'd be able to start working. So it would be really good to mention that to the employer. So those are questions you're going to be asked on nearly every application that you submit. So I would advise that you can say yes to that first question. You're authorized to work in the US. You will be at the time that you would start working. But for the second question, you will need to indicate that yes, in the future, you would require sponsorship. And then I have a question here that says, if your position starts on August 1st and ends July 31st of 2025, so it would be a full year, would I have to renew the OPT? I'm in a STEM field, but what if I wasn't? So August 1st is of course later than the latest possible requested start date for OPT based off of a May 19th graduation. If that's the case, that you would not be able to complete that entire year contract. So I would talk to the employer about it. If you're in a STEM field and you have the STEM extension and this employment would satisfy their criteria of the STEM OPT extension, then potentially you could continue working while on your STEM OPT. However, if you only have 1 year of OPT, that end date is the last day you're authorized to be working in the US, unless you have some other sort of status that you plan to change to after the end of your OPT. So please keep that in mind, specifically if you're applying for a job that is a very specific term period. Make sure that you're going to be authorized for the duration of that time that they're asking you to work, or potentially let them know that you will not be, and see if sponsorship may be part of the something that they would do for you to allow you to continue working. Is there a chance that the application to renew my F1 visa will be denied even though the OPT is already approved? I will say that a visa application is an application, and only the consular officer at the U.S. consulate where you apply for the visa can determine whether or not you are eligible for the F1 visa renewal. I will also note that as long as you have all of the documentation, including your EAD card, we recommend you bring a confirmation of employment, like an offer letter with you to that appointment. I would say that we don't foresee any issues in that process. However, again, it is up to that consular officer to make that decision about whether or not to approve you for the visa. Some things that may impact that decision: if you are approved for OPT, but maybe you've started the process of applying for a green card or permanent residency, at that point, we would not advise that you apply for an F1 visa. So if that's your plan, please come talk to us. But otherwise, we give you all of the documentation we suggest that you carry with you. We have an entire webpage about renewing your F1 visa, and there's a specific section for students who are on OPT. And I think as long as you have all of those documents with you, you are best positioned to be approved for the visa. Of course, the final decision is always up to the consular officer.
Zaina, I think there's a lot of repetition between the questions you got and that were in the Q&A and in other chats. So I think
Okay,
everyone,
perfect.
yeah.
I think that's most of them. Okay, any other last minute questions? Feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll stick around for 2 more minutes. If that's all, you all are welcome to go. Thank you so much for attending.
Zaina, I think we had said we could also just show the form if people.
Oh, yes.
We'll
Yeah.
formally end in about 2 minutes. So the Q&A we can wrap up there.
Okay. Do you want to share your screen, Leah?
Yeah, let me see if I can override you. So one of the main forms that you could actually submit tonight, if you already have a sense of what you want your authorization start date to be, is the OPT I-20 request form for post-completion. Somebody did ask about pre-completion. There's a different form for that. You should reach out to us. Whether you have a STEM OPT extension option or not, you're going to start with this application tonight, or for this application period. So we have a question here about attending a session. If you're here tonight, you can complete that. We're looking for a non-Notre Dame email address. This is really important because it will go into the SEVP portal, and that's how we will communicate with you and the US government will communicate with you. We are going to ask you for your I-94 record. It's really essential, especially if you are traveling over spring break, that you ensure that you have entered the US again in F1 status. So that we want to see when you apply, what's your most recent entry when you apply. And then through that OPT period, you want to continue to enter the US in F1 status. We have a few questions here about program type. And so if you were a bachelor student, then there will be a series of questions about when you're going to graduate. So spring 2024 would be your graduation date. Those of you asking about a summer graduation date, or even into next fall, there's also options here. You'll identify what your graduation date is. And here's where you are going to tell us what you want your authorization start date to be. And there were so many good questions about the employment start date versus the authorization start date. So you may not be ready to make that decision tonight. But this is where you are going to determine what is the start date that you want on your EAD card that you're going to submit to USCIS. And we'll print that right on the I-20 when we process the OPT I-20. So if you need to wait, this is often the main reason people are waiting a little bit longer, like Zaina said, because of graduate school, because you're just waiting to hear more confirmation from your employer. Maybe you're waiting to hear on a short-term opportunity over the summer, but we will have to have this OPT authorization start date before we issue the I-20. We are just asking about the premium processing if you intend to apply for that. Currently it's $1,500, it will go up. And then on the academic approver information, Zaina referenced this, and you will have to identify an approver for your OPT. And we have identified a number of options here. So if you're a professional student in Mendoza GBP, it's very clear who you're going to put down as the academic approver, because they're going to have information about your graduation date, and they're going to have information about whether you're eligible, whether you're meeting the degree requirements, or you are expected to. Undergraduates, this is often going to be your director of undergraduate studies that will sign off on this. Maybe there's an advising dean. If you are in Mendoza undergraduate program, it will probably be Dr. Shropshire, as you can see here. But in other colleges, other departments, you're going to look to your director of undergraduate studies to help with this approval process to confirm that you will be expected to graduate in May. And graduate students, again, it may be your director of graduate studies. It also may be your thesis or dissertation advisor. So you can speak with them about that and ask them what makes the most sense, who can confirm your expected graduation. You'll list here their name, their email, and then they will automatically get that email. And there are a number of checkboxes here, confirmations of understanding that we're asking you to complete, so that we can just confirm that you've heard the information. We've given you so much information tonight, but that you've heard it and that you are aware of your responsibilities while you are applying for OPT and while you are on your OPT authorization period. So very straightforward form. For those of you who are, I'm going to go back up here because I only chose the bachelor students. For those of you who are doctoral or masters with thesis, Zaina referenced that you have a little bit more flexibility on your program end date. So we have a small description here of those options. And then you'll choose what is the completion option that you are basing your program end date on. Are you choosing your defense date? Are you choosing your submission date? Are you choosing the last day of an assistantship in your final semester? Or are you sticking with that published date of graduation? You cannot choose a date after your graduation. So that is the last possible choice. But all of these are available to you. And I would say probably 60% of students do choose the published date of graduation. That makes the most sense for them. If you have any questions, you should reach out to us during our virtual drop-in hours, advising hours, or our walk-in advising hours. And we'll have both of those tomorrow and Wednesday. But that's going to impact what expected program completion date you choose. The program completion date is going to be before your authorization start date. And so both of these, you may have to think about these a little bit before you enter this form. But everyone on the call today, if you're graduating in May, graduating this summer, this is where you're going to start the process, is on this form. So I'm going to stop sharing and give that 1 minute back.
All right, thank you for that, Leah. I think we've answered all of the questions that came through the Q&A. Elaine is typing the last one as we speak, so we'll stick around for another minute if other questions come up. Otherwise, that's the end of our formal presentation, and please go ahead and submit that request for the I-20 so that we can get going with that processing. Thank you all for attending this evening, and please don't hesitate to reach out to the ISSA team if we can answer any other questions throughout this process.